GRDC just put out a DVD recently talking about long season, growing things in long season areas, but talking about sowing canola and wheat in November. What are the consequences for pests of growing canola or wheat in November sowing?
Who wants to tackle that?
I can make a comment in terms of, certainly in terms of diamondback moth. We would look, canola, as with forage brassicas that are grown sort of sown in late spring in certain regions of southeastern Australia, tend to get really quite a substantial DBM pest load. So I would anticipate that, and we do have some experience there. There was historically, it's really reduced over more recent years, but historically there had been 5,000 to 10,000 hectares of spring-sown canola grown down the lower southeast in South Australia, and it was heavily hammered by diamondback moth in most years. So I think that pest alone would apply a considerable management challenge. And some of the other sort of pest issues that would sort of perhaps present, what Rutherglen bug I think would clearly be a significant challenge with even to a greater degree with spring sown canola than perhaps in most years with winter sown. And establishment pests, it's perhaps a little less clear, but I think the challenges would be equally as great as with winter sown and may even be in some instances more problematic. So, do you?
Yeah, look, is this on?
No.
No. Just probably on the top there.
Clear that?
Yep.
Yep.
No, you're on.
Yeah, look, I guess just to follow on from Greg, I mean, talking about some specifics, for those that that heard the talks this morning about the beet western yellows virus and green peach aphid that Bill mentioned before. Clearly that creates an extended green bridge for both the virus and the aphid, so it's also going to present challenges in that space as well. But I guess they're the negative consequences that we've discussed. I guess the reality is we don't exactly know what the outcomes will be. We've certainly got a lot of evidence to suggest in the last 15 to 20 years with changing in farming practices, particularly stubble retention, no-till, that whole shift has certainly resulted in a change in the pest status of a number of different species. Slugs is a classic example, but there's also been some, I guess, benefits in terms of some of the non-pest invertebrates. So caravid beetles, for example, have actually also benefited under that system. So I think undoubtedly it will impact on the pest status and the changing dynamics of a number of different species, both pest and non-pest invertebrates. We've mentioned a couple of examples, but I mean, I think, in many cases we just don't know.
Yeah, Greg and Paul. Chris Saunders from the engineering group at UniSA. A bit of a left-wing question. Monitoring and identification of pests. Do we have enough, especially like real-time, up-to-date information on where the pests are when the outbreak occurs or whatever? And is there room for potentially, more monitoring technology?
Do you want me to? Sure. Yeah, look, undoubtedly, Chris, there are. I mean, we in fact, Paul and I were just discussing that a short while ago. There's both when it comes to establishment pests, there's a real paucity of easy sort of monitoring sort of techniques that you can undertake in a timely fashion. Part of the problem is that a lot of those establishment pests are nocturnal. That sort of adds a further element of a challenge around ready sort of monitoring of those. But we really are, I think, still somewhat in the dark ages in terms of more state-of-the-art sort of monitoring techniques. You could conceive of a future where I think as costs continue to come down, perhaps with some of the molecular technologies to be able to develop molecular approaches to monitoring establishment pests. On the other side of the equation, around the sort of spring suite of pests, there's still a lot that we're not doing in Australia that perhaps do occur with some some of our cousins in the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, there was a question in the first session this morning on beet western yellows virus, whether there's what the potential there would be for further sort of aphid monitoring in Australia. There's very little of that occurring. I mean, in that particular question, there was reference to the New Zealand experience with aphid monitoring. We know that the United Kingdom and, as I understand, certain parts of the US have had sort of long-term sort of aphid monitoring systems in place. We have none of that, and nothing really systematically established for sort of moths, caterpillar pests as well, where there are well-established sort of pheromone sort of trapping sort of approaches that could be being deployed. Now, some of that lack of sort of tools there is being addressed by the CRC for plant biosecurity and the GRDC investment that they are making in that CRC. So I'm aware and partly involved in some of the work that's being undertaken to see if we could develop a more sort of cost-effective sort of suction trapping system for aphid monitoring that could be deployed across southern Australia, and similarly looking at the potential to get a more automated pheromone sort of trapping or trap design for monitoring these spring sort of moth pests, and looking at the potential then in turn to stack a number of different pheromones, so for perhaps to be able to have the one automated trap deployed that would be able to monitor for, say, native budworm, Ediella, diamondback moth, and some of the biosecurity sort of threats, in that case turnip moth that occurs in parts of the northern hemisphere, a potential pest to the Australian grains industry. So sort of stacking pheromones together for that combined purpose of biosecurity and ongoing annual pest detection.
Have you got a comment, Paul?
Look, I guess I agree with everything that Greg has said. I mean, it is a particular challenge to monitor such broad, large, I guess, areas of land in a timely fashion. And I guess the other thing that I might just mention that I guess you'd like to see going forwards is not just monitoring for pests and trying to get estimates of numbers, which is critical to making smart management decisions, we know that. But in the case of, green peach aphid, red-legged earth mites, diamondback moth, some of these species that have resistance, also trying to actually monitor for resistance status within populations before chemicals are applied would be, I guess, a lovely place to be, so that we actually are using chemicals in an intelligent way and we're not wasting chemicals unnecessarily. So that would be, I guess, again, where we, I guess, would love to see us head.
I know it's insect specific too, but Greg, you might even touch on the monitoring techniques you're using in the snail projects at the moment with cameras observing.
Yes, I mean, sorry, I should have
so we'll
made
shift off the aphid for a tick and look at some other species.
Well, that is a good example, Bill, where thanks to largely some forward thinking by Michael Richards that have been known to a number of you, we've, as part of the snail research that we're engaged in, we're using automated camera systems linked up with metadata, data logger sort of collection devices to be able to real-time monitor snail, sort of diurnal sort of patterns of snail activity, and and the purpose of that, obviously, that we are very conscious of the fact that when it comes to baiting for snails, we really don't fully understand the optimal timing of those baiting treatments. So by using these sorts of surveillance and monitoring methods for the use of cameras, we're beginning to, and linking that with the microclimatic data, working towards an understanding of what are the key environmental triggers that initiate snail activity, snail feeding, snail attraction to baits. So, and hopefully through that, in another couple of years' time, be in a position to be able to advise far more effectively than we can at the moment around optimal timing of those treatments.
I'm just going to make a comment too about the difficulty of monitoring at the paddock level, with full stubble retention systems, and particularly with taller and taller cereal stubbles in the case of the use of disc seeders, for example. It's very difficult to even monitor at the paddock scale, because you're just looking at this sea of stubble until the crops well and truly emerge. So from the farmer and advisor perspective, in terms of monitoring pest outbreaks, it's very difficult, and it's not until the grower's on the tractor going over the paddock and spraying something that they see these large areas of crop that have been smashed by whatever insect might have, done the damage. So this whole issue of monitoring at the regional scale and then again at the paddock scale is perhaps an issue that we could think more about and look at some other systems to perhaps help identify.
Yeah, and I mean, just following on from that point, I think it's particularly challenging when you start to consider these migratory species that, you can be faced with a situation where a paddock has not had a pest issue for a number of years,
yep.
and then all of a sudden, bronze field beetles are, rife within a paddock at sowing time, or obviously migratory Lepidoptera moths that can fly in unannounced. I guess the advantage that we have with some of the resident species, slugs for example, is that we can start to build up a bit of a picture of what to expect at least. So if we're thinking ahead, we can actually at least preempt that this particular paddock might be at higher risk than others for slugs, for example.
Yep.
So that's where at least you might focus some additional effort to monitoring early.
Yep. Okay. Greg, have you got another comment?
That whole issue, particularly at the paddock scales that we're now operating, I mean, with most of these invertebrates, they really are quite patchy within a paddock, and understanding that spatial variability, and perhaps, there's a lot of focus at the present around the sort of potentially UAVs as a sort of sensor platform, and whether, there's the potential, obviously, to perhaps be able to more preemptively, sort of using those sort of technologies to be able to judge where there are perhaps, where there's a green vegetation deficit within a establishing crop, and then get in there, check then use some more traditional sampling methods to determine what the causal agent is, and then take appropriate remedial action.
Yep. There's a couple of questions on the board there, guys. I'll let you. So the first one, the transform showing signs of breakdown to GPA in the Hort sector in Virginia, prevailing wind direction to the mid-north. How long have we got before we see breakdown of transform? Paul, chuck that one at you. What's a typical life of an insecticide, I guess?
First of all, I'd love for the person that actually texted that in to come up and speak to me afterwards, because I'm certainly intrigued by that comment that transform's breaking down in Virginia. There is, at least in terms of what we've seen, and we're fairly well across GPA, both in horticulture and in broadacre, we've seen no evidence to suggest that transform's breaking down yet. Certainly, I would not discount it though, and that's why I'm very keen to speak to whoever sent that in, because we'd be very keen to get our hands on that population and have a look at that closely, just to confirm what is going on.
Are you sampling through that region? Those high intense. Are you sampling in that region?
Yeah, we've actually been working with SARDI, Helen de Graaf, within Greg's team to actually get both vegetable and canola populations from right across South Australia, including
Virginia.
This particular region, I should say.
Yeah.
But as I said, these things, we know GPA has the propensity to develop resistance quickly, so I guess anything's possible. But my immediate suspicion and gut feeling is that perhaps the thought around the breakdown could be an actual application issue. Certainly it's not a product like synthetic pyrethroid in terms of the way it works. There are issues with getting coverage into crops, particularly given that GPA often reside on the lower leaves and on the underside of leaves, so contact with the aphid is quite problematic. I guess that's my initial thoughts on that particular comment. But as I said, I'd love for that person to come up and have a chat to me about it, and I'd be more than happy to be proven wrong.
But if that's all we have, what's a best guess? Intuitive gut feel. How long have we got if we don't have resistance at the moment?
It depends how it's used, and of course with transform, as with all of our insecticides when targeting GPA, it's not just how it's used in broadacre, but perhaps it's even more influenced by how it's used in vegetables. Obviously in vegetable crops we have a few other options to control GPA, where again we don't have resistance yet confirmed. So Movento is one product, for example, which is another chemical class. We have Transform, we have some other chemicals that are coming onto the market in horticulture. Hopefully we have some more coming onto the market in the grains industry in the not too distant future, and that will be pivotal to making sure that we don't have to rely on Transform repeatedly through a season. And so if we can actually use Transform once, perhaps maximum twice through a season, then I think the longevity of that product will be extended. But that relies upon us having other options to use in the situation where we're going to be applying multiple applications to target aphids. But the challenge, as I said, with GPA, unlike some species like red-legged earth mites, is the selection pressure in other industries that we just can't control, and obviously we have also a lot more sprays going out in those particular vegetable crops.
Okay, next question was, other than burning stubble, are there any options to control earwigs and millipedes in canola and cereals?
Add Mandilotus to that for me.
So do you want to deal with them independently or
Sure.
as a group? So earwigs first.
Well, I mean, this is a classic example of where, through the pest facts, and I'm sure I could speak on behalf of the SARDI group here in South Australia, we get this sort of question time and time again, and I guess the short answer is we really don't have a great sense of what the best management options are because we simply don't know much about them. And so, I guess I do feel a little bit limited in what we can say in this space, and certainly we'd love to have a better understanding of what the management options are. But beyond what is mentioned there in terms of burning stubble, which can be very effective but can also be somewhat hit and miss, the use of insecticide seed dressings is certainly something that is used more and more in New South Wales, Victoria, and I guess also here, specifically to target both earwigs and millipedes. So for earwigs, for example, Cosmos is certainly, a far more superior insecticide seed dressing than your imidacloprid neonicotinoid-based seed dressings. Obviously, it has, less efficacy against some of our other main pests like mites and aphids and lucerne flea though. So that's a trade-off with that particular product. And with millipedes, I don't exactly know which seed dressing is going to be the best. Again, we just don't have a great deal of understanding about that. But certainly, the earwigs, which have perhaps raised their head a little bit more in Victoria for a number of years, a lot of the Victorians, certainly agronomists, particularly in the Western District, where earwigs are quite a problem, will be the ones that basically are telling us that, they'll use Cosmos if they know that a paddock's going to be hit with earwigs, recognise that they can then go in with a foliar application to control some of the other crop establishment pests.
Yeah, if I could, just specifically in relation to Portuguese millipede, as a result of work that was done, it goes back almost 25 years ago, we, here in Adelaide, through SARDI, identified a particular nematode bacteria combination that is pathogenic to this exotic species of European millipede, and have been able to deploy that in the urban landscape, and would appear to have reduced, they had some controlling effect on Portuguese millipede populations in those urban situations. We have no knowledge as to what its occurrence is in the broadacre landscape, and whether it could be used as a longer term remedial sort of biological control measure for that species. But it's an example where I think we've still got such a paucity of just basic biological and related sort of biological control information about many of these newer pests that it makes more sophisticated responses to their management really difficult. And in that respect, I'll just go on Richard's point about Mandilotus. We as a result of the GRDC support, our group, led by Kim Perry, has done a little bit of work over the previous couple of seasons on Mandilotus and got a handle on the basic biology, which helps inform what we can possibly do at this juncture. We now understand, when they become active, what triggers that. It appears to be very much a sort of a rain event, sort of mediated emergence of adults from the soil in mid-autumn. They continue to emerge over a couple of months, which is then part of the problem with a one-shot chemical treatment. You've got adults perhaps coming out for at least 6, if not 8 or more weeks, which does make effective control with just a single application to where that application needs to preempt the egg laying by the earliest cohorts of adults that are emerging, makes it sort of problematic. Further, with the insecticide trial work that was done there, we identified sort of 2 treatments that at least have some efficacy, but neither were high order. They were more around 50% sort of control rather than your 90 plus type control, and they being a Cosmos seed treatment and Telstar bifenthrin bare earth treatment. So, but as I said, control levels not fantastic.
There's a bit of interest in fluid or liquid systems to apply a whole range of products. Have you got a comment on the use of fluid systems and insecticides and how effective they might be on some of these crop emergence pests? Greg or Paul? Who did?
You take that one.
Thanks.
Got a comment?
Well, yeah, it's an area. This is not informing anyone. I guess it's an area that we need to do. Yeah, there needs to be some further work done in that area. But
there's been some claims being made by a few growers that are using some products, saying, "Look, this is working really well on some of these problematic pests." And
are they more soil-borne pests like wireworms, false wireworms?
Well, earwigs and millipedes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I could certainly see from a wireworm perspective, given that still to this day probably, and I'm thinking particularly about the Wimmera region in Victoria where false wireworms are quite problematic, incorporation of chlorpyrifos sowing is still the #1 management tactic for those particular beetle groups. So, I can certainly see how, that sort of technology could be applied in that space. But I've certainly not seen any evidence or any data of what it looks like and how effective it is. But I could certainly see at a theoretical level how it could be actually quite useful targeting those particular species.
We'd like to see any resistance develop with either the application that way or maybe and again if we go back to different forms of application, seed dressing application. Is there any evidence that we're seeing resistance development to existing practices with seed treatments to any insect and any insecticide group?
So I guess the question is more around are the different applications of chemicals likely to exacerbate resistance issues?
Yep.
Not necessarily per se. I don't really think one technique is going to be worse or better than another. I guess at least in my view, it's more around if we're using insecticide seed treatments early in the season, and I mean obviously we don't have this luxury in broadacre anyway, but at the moment a lot of our insecticide seed treatments are neonicotinoid based.
Yep.
If we were then to follow up with a Confidor spray, for example, through the season, that then I guess puts the selection pressure back on that particular pest because it's getting that exposure to the early seed treatment followed up with a follow application. I guess where there is still some debate around the seed dressings is that period when the product starts to become diluted within a plant as a plant grows, and the individuals that are then feeding on that plant start to pick up non-lethal doses. But that question then comes back to the mechanism, I guess, that particular pest is using, and a lot of these mechanisms are very well characterised to actually overcome that resistance. So it really does depend on a number of different factors.
Can I just add to that? Just from my limited understanding of sort of insecticide resistance sort of theory, generally the greater the persistence or the residual persistence exposure to a compound, the greater the that sort of selection risk. So, and many of those soil-based sort of and seed treatment sort of treatments tend to have a greater sort of residual half-life than alternate sort of formulations. So there's potentially some additional sort of risk there. But further, perhaps the greatest attendant risk is that there's obviously a very great temptation just to annually then use the seed treatment, and just by that alone, as opposed to a more traditional IPM approach of assessing whether there really is a need and only treating perhaps in 3 out of 5 years rather than 5 out of 5 years, you are by definition increasing that resistance risk.
That's the very point, isn't it? You know, so difficult to monitor insect pest outbreaks at the paddock level these days because of full stubble retention, greater incidence of some of these problematic pests, but also the good old-fashioned ones, the red-legged earth mite, lucent flea, those sorts of things. So we think we're doing the right thing by applying seed dressings and we think this is part of an integrated pest management practice, and we need to be ahead of the game to avoid those outbreaks that like beet western yellows, because the impact of an outbreak of a problem like that is huge and pays for a lot of pesticide. So I get a little confused, I guess, as to whether we're practicing an IPM problem or whether actually creating another resistance problem in using seed dressings. We still need to mix up these approaches, don't we?
I think that's right. I think exactly what Greg said is, I think they are an important, in my view, are an important tool, and I guess if you want to use the term, to me they do fit within an IPM toolkit, just in their nature, in that obviously they're not knocking out all the beneficial insects as a broad spectrum bare earth application would. But absolutely, I think they need to be used in amongst other tactics, and certainly not relied upon year in, year out. And so making that assessment going into a season, if a paddock for whatever reason is, in your mind, very low risk of actually being attacked, then certainly asking the question of whether we actually need to use that seed dressing or not is certainly something that I think is well worth considering. Yeah.
I guess that leads into this next question. Where are the non-chemical options for dealing with these damaging insect issues? Are they out there?
Pretty broad question.
Yep.
Which, can we get any more specifics on the actual insects, or?
I guess that's a hard thing. And we've had I'm going to make a comment here, Paul, because Paul and Greg and I have been working in a program to look and address this integrated pest management issue. And really, while we think about, maybe you might make a comment about this, Paul, yourself, but really I think we tend to confuse IPM. It's a big issue, but when you think about integrated pest management, it's really, I think, pays to chunk down to the specific pest that you're dealing with, and to think through the strategies that you've got and think through paddock by paddock, rather than saying, what's the IPM strategy here? Because it is quite specific to the pest you're dealing with and the crop types you're growing. Perhaps you've got a comment.
Well, I think just to extend that point, I certainly pick up on the essence of that question, that for some species we probably don't have a lot of options, I think is the actual answer, that are non-chemical based at the moment. But then again, there are options and there are circumstances where we can do things both culturally and chemically to lower our risk of actually having, a pest outbreak or a crop loss. And again, for those that saw the presentations this morning around the aphid and the beet western yellows virus, we have put forward recommendations leading into this season, which some are based around the use of insecticide seed dressings, but there are also recommendations about controlling a green bridge. There are recommendations about making sure we don't sow early, we sow into stubble. These sorts of things can all have an impact on, driving down populations, in that case of an aphid, without, solely relying on, let's just wait and see if aphids turn up and then spray them. So I do believe that it is very much a case-by-case situation. We work with a bunch of species, and for a lot of them, it is very hard to come up with non-chemical options that are reliable in the current day and age. But there are cases where there's definitely stuff that we can do. Slugs is another classic example where
snails. I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of the sort of the summer control measures for snails, which so a lot of these non-chemical options do often relate to this time of the year, this sort of the pre-season sort of planning and taking remedial actions, as with snails, with beating or trying to get snails down onto the ground, exposing them to extreme summer heat, burning strategically where appropriate, but further sort of planning, and understanding a sort of paddock history, trying to wherever possible sort of modifying sort of a rotation to take account of sort of paddock history in not only in terms of invertebrate pests, but more broadly, summer weed management, etc. I mean, there are a number of things, and then within season, I mean, I guess just as an anecdote, back to one of my sort of favourite sort of insects, diamondback moth. I mean, there were a number of reports from South Australian agronomists, at least last year, of canola, where in an association with canola crops which had a lighter spray program earlier in the season, then having the diamondback moth having diamondback moth infestation present, but those infestations not continuing to increase and reach spray thresholds. So an apparent association there between a greater sort of natural enemy activity as a result of the lighter spray program, turning into a mid-spring situation where a specific DBM insecticide wasn't required. So I think just really critically examining spray programs wherever possible, trying to use more selective chemistry and really limiting unnecessary spray treatments to give that natural enemy complex an opportunity to contribute to pest regulation is something that we can do more of, I think, than what we're generally doing at the present.
Thanks, Greg. Question from George Pedler.
Yeah, my question's actually following on from that is, can you go into more detail? Obviously, we had great results last year with ladybirds coming in and cleaning up the DBM populations. Is there anything that we can be doing different? Obviously, everyone's using the insecticide bomb pretty much. Are there any insecticides that we can use that aren't going to clean up ladybirds and look after Gascon so he looks after us?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, sure.
Look, there certainly are. The perversity, though, is that the older chemistry is so much cheaper. It basically, with some exception, newer chemistry, by and large, the current sort of generation of insecticides are far more selective, but not only in terms of their non-invertebrate toxicity, but within the sort of invertebrate communities, far more selective against certain groups of insects and related arthropods and invertebrates than the older sort of pyrethroid and organophosphate chemistry. So, but given that we're often dealing with very tight gross margins, just a catch-all old pyrethroid is still a very seductive, compelling sort of choice for most. I mean, that's the brutal reality. When you're comparing a buck or two per hectare compared with, say, something like for a pyrethroid treatment versus some of this sharper, newer chemistry, which you may be talking price tags more in the $30 to $45 a hectare sort of bracket, it becomes a difficult economic decision. But there are definitely options out there if you're willing to use a slightly different economic metric in your thinking, a sort of a longer term thinking that you do wish to try and harness that natural control by going with those softer but unfortunately considerably more expensive options.
But I mean, one example where perhaps that cost differential isn't as great as it once was is pyramecarb, which is a very selective aphicide, particularly for the ladybirds that you mentioned, but also small parasitic wasps. lacewings are the natural enemies, and he's still a very effective aphicide, even at fairly low rates. And so that is, quite a compelling case to use pyramecarb particularly in spring, when the natural enemies are really building up and having an impact on aphid populations. Obviously, we have some resistance issues in one particular aphid species, but a whole bunch of other aphids are very effectively controlled with that product. And the cost difference is certainly not as great as it is with some of the other products that I guess Greg's referring to.
Thanks, guys.
Yep, we've got a quick one from Judy Velati.
Hi guys at the front. I just wanted you to maybe highlight the difference between some of the IPM strategies that you can do for the residents pests versus, say, some of those transients, and how there is actually some good strategies, particularly around the preventative and containment strategies around those residents that people deal with. And it's probably a good starting point for some of the consultants to be doing IPM around those. So can you maybe highlight one of those? Snails, slugs?
Well, yeah, we've already alluded to some of the snail, sort of summer cultural control options.
I guess, the slugs is another one, I guess, Judy, where, obviously, we alluded to that particular example before where, generally speaking, if you've had a slug issue in a paddock, the chances are that that issue will be there next year. And so, recognising that there are things that can be done leading into that year over the summer to, I guess, mitigate the chances of high slug populations emerging at that time that the crops are emerging. So we can think about putting in perhaps less susceptible crops. Obviously, canola is the most susceptible crop to slugs. If we've got a paddock where we know or have a fairly strong suspicion that we're going to have high slug populations, then certainly I'd be considering something a little bit more hardy like cereals, but of course cereals can still certainly be severely attacked if slug numbers are great. Reducing stubble loads over summer, burning stubbles on occasion can actually be a useful strategy, particularly over the longer term, to drive down numbers within a paddock over a number of generations. They're just a couple of examples, I guess. And again, similar to the snail story that Greg alluded to, the timing of baiting, even though it is obviously relying on chemical controls, is critical as it is with snails. If the timing is not right, you're really dropping your efficacy. Michael Nash talks about, efficacy dropping well below 30% if you don't get that bait out at the right time. So, certainly, there are things that can be done, but I guess it's just understanding what we're particularly targeting.
Yeah. A better appreciation of, I guess, plant or crop sort of resistance on the one hand, and crop's contribution to the fecundity and development of pests. So Michael Nash from our group is presently doing some work with slug pests. It's not perhaps so relevant to South Australia, but in parts of Victoria where linseed actually is grown as part of the cereal rotation, we're finding that there's dramatic differences in the effect of linseed versus canola on the fecundity and development of these slug species. So to try and help manage slugs and bring population densities down, it does appear as if linseed in a cereal rotation may be able to be deployed specifically to help as a non-chemical way of trying to longer term manage slug issues, as another example.
Okay, final closing comment, and I'll as an industry, you guys are sitting back working as entomologists, supporting advisors out there doing the job with farmers. What's the one thing we could do better? If there's one thing you could make us do differently, what would it be? We must be doing a bloody good job, guys. Putting you on the spot. Come on, fess up, Paul. What do you reckon we could work on?
Look, I guess a lot of our work is focused principally around crop establishment, and so I guess that's the area that I know best. And I guess, as an industry, and I assume it's quite similar in SA to where I reside, which is Vic, and I guess working in New South Wales. There are still a number of insurance sprays that are put out on crops, bare earth treatments, but also, I guess, just post-emergent sprays that I guess are not well founded on this premise of trying to assess risk in the first place, if it's a bare earth, or some sort of monitoring before that decision's made. Often that decision is more around practicalities, and I absolutely appreciate that they are genuine issues to deal with. But I guess what that does is potentially have a number of negative consequences. Greg's alluded to one example last year with DBM where early sprays can ultimately end up resulting in other pest issues later in the season because we're knocking out beneficials. There is a bunch of data that has shown many case studies where that is the case. Yep. Particularly, some of the work that's been done in northern New South Wales and Queensland has clearly illustrated if we can go softer early, we do get a payoff later in the year. And certainly, I guess a topic that's close to my heart is around, what this is doing from a resistance point of view as well. Yep. And so, thinking about, whether we really do need to apply those chemicals and using them in such a way that those chemicals will be around for quite a while, I guess. And so I guess there's those two elements that to me, I guess, potentially have some benefits if we do start to sort of fall back from that insurance spray mentality early on in the season.
All right, that's a good message. Greg, have you got
well,
one?
I agree. I recognise that, I guess, for lack of a better term, the sort of business model that many are working under as agronomists sort of does make, some of this rather difficult to sort of juggle. But clearly there's often some immediate attendant risk with going light with your insecticide program. But I think more often than not, there can be genuine benefits by really, doing some hard reflection on whether or not you really do need a spray treatment, and then in terms of the choice of that particular product, trying to select wherever possible, more specific products that have less negative effects. But further, I think generally as an industry, what we need to be, going back to I think Chris's point, one of the things I think we clearly do need to assist in being able to do more robust, timely, precise monitoring is we do need better invertebrate monitoring tools than what we've got as an industry at the present. And I think the more that GRDC could invest in that area, the better we're all going to be in a decade's time.
All right, please join me in thanking Paul and Greg. Well done, guys. Good.